All right, let me see. We were watching this today. Let's continue it a little bit. We were at around minute 22. This is from the Lex Friedman podcast, and he was talking about the Byzantine Empire versus the Western Roman Empire. And this professor thinks that the Byzantine Empire is a continuation of the Roman Empire. And I've been approaching this, kind of pushing back a little bit just for the sake of discussion and conversation. But I do love that it's focused on the Roman Empire as a whole, the whole thing, which I love. So let's go.
Romans from a republic in Rome, and those are very, very different situations. And no doubt they would look and seem foreign to each other, right? The question is, why do we assume that someone like Hadrian, right, an emperor from the 2nd century,
I think I've already reacted to this, maybe not.
A cosmopolitan figure who travels around the empire with his Greek lover and writes poems and has a Greek beard and loves Greek culture and has much to do with someone from the Middle Republic who's...
I gotta say something though about the beard. It's a good beard, but it's not a Greek beard yet. Need more work.
Yeah, some warrior who's chasing down cattle from the Samnites. I mean, and
based warrior, by the way. Those Samnites.
Yet the way we understand history is that, oh no, those belong together, Hadrian and this ancient Roman from the 4th century BC.
Right.
But not Hadrian and someone, an emperor a few centuries later who's just like him, bilingual in Greek and Latin, who's kind of cosmopolitan, who, reads the same stuff, because we posit this rupture between Roman and Byzantine.
One of the ways...
Okay, that's an interesting... So the idea is, if I understood it correctly, the idea is you can take Hadrian, Roman emperor, and then he has less in common with the warrior Muppet that chases the, whatever you said, Salmation, whatever it was. They have less in common, even though they're from the same period, than someone from the Byzantine period who also speaks Greek and maybe is as educated as him. I'm not sure that that's a great way to put it, to be honest. It's interesting. But the reason why I push back against it a little bit is because still they are from the same period and probably the same geographic area. And they will have a lot in common, even though they belong to different strata of society. That is the real difference between the emperor and the warrior chasing the enemy off the fields and cattle, whatever it was. But they're still from the same period and the same geographic location. It would be like saying that a modern English person, like a super ultra professor from London and some guy in the rural area of England, they're both English. They have more in common than someone from the future from a completely different geographic area. I still think they have more in common. Also because, remember, they're both native Latin speakers. The simple fact that the emperor is educated and understands Latin as Greek as a second language doesn't put him in the same perspective as someone from the Byzantine Empire who speaks Greek as a first language and perhaps knows Latin because of his education. I don't know. I'm not sure it's really that strong of an idea, because then you could use that to mean anything. You could use that to mean like, well, we all have the same, like someone from Italy right now has less in common with someone from Japan, simply because, I speak Japanese because I'm educated. Like, it's kind of weird. I don't know.
You can try to analyze this is, for example, looking at a very specific role in society across time. So we can look at soldiers.
Right.
How they saw violence, for example.
Oh, nice.
That's
okay.
one way.
Nice.
So
topic.
You're making me realize that we can just take 1,000 different professions and positions in society and really specifically look at what the experience of the world was like.
Yeah.
And so one of them is the view on violence across time, and then the other is the view on the role of the.
This is very interesting, but I'm going to speed them up if you don't mind. I'm going to go for 1.25.
The government.
Yeah.
Across time.
That's an excellent way of putting it. So take soldiers, for example, they swear an oath.
Yes.
Right now, we don't have the oath for every gift.
The oaths are going to be similar between, Roman soldiers and even people in the Byzantine time.
Period. Yeah. We have some approximations of it, some hints of what it contained. But we know that Roman soldiers swore an oath, like throughout all of the centuries of the empire. Sometimes they might add like a Christian formula to
it. Yeah, of course, once it becomes Christianized.
Sometimes before that, not. But they swore basically to protect the republic, or depending on what term they used, or the empire or the emperor.
Yes.
And this is something that they would have recognized very quickly. Like if they met each other over time and said, hey, what was your oath like? And they recited it, this would have made much sense to them, right? Or take, for example, a woman who runs a business, right? From any century of the empire, it would have been, especially the later you go, the more so, that this woman is enabled to do this by virtue of Roman law.
Yeah.
Certain, Roman law of property and inheritance and marriage, but also regulations regarding who can do what and what kinds of properties women can handle. And
he's going to compare it to, I think I know where he's going with this.
under what circumstances. This is something that Roman women had in common that many other cultures did not. So I'll give you an example. So, for example, in the 10th, 11th century, there are Jewish women.
Jewish, I knew it. Yeah, Jewish women using Roman law because it's advantageous to them as opposed to Jewish temple law.
Who live in the Eastern Roman Empire.
Very good point.
Who realize that they have more rights in Roman courts than in rabbinical ones.
True.
And they take their disputes to the Roman courts.
I kind of like this guy. I like how he smiles.
Now, the thing is that for the Romans, these are property matters, not religious matters. But for the rabbis, these are religious matters. But the Roman courts trump the Jewish courts in the empire, right? And so you end up with a situation where Jewish women have more rights than Jewish
This guy's good.
women do elsewhere because Roman law is not operative. And there you go. Like these things matter, right? And that's a function of imperial law.
And this would be an interesting actually interplay between the law and religious institutions
right
throughout the East Roman Empire.
And the West, to be honest. I mean, Augustus was considered to be divine. So it's not like there is an important religious qualification to a lot of leaders throughout a lot of different cultures. The Egyptians are the obvious one, like when we think, well, the ancient Egyptians considered the pharaoh to be divine. The Japanese considered the emperor to be divine. And so did the Romans. I guess there is common thread. There's common thread.
So you argue that even though the personality of the various emperors varied, as we'll talk about, and as they're often venerated, celebrated, criticized, talked about, the late Roman Empire was projecting a persona to its citizens that was consistent throughout its history. Can you describe what you mean by this and describe the different detailed characteristics of this persona?
Yes. So this persona, it's what the government or the emperor, the court, and the spokesman, the bureaucracy want their subjects to think this whole thing is about. Like, how is power being used? Why and for whom, right? And
think a bit of the Chinese mandate from heaven, for instance, very similar as a concept.
They do so in laws that they promulgate throughout the empire. Sometimes they have these laws read in church, for example, or posted publicly. They're definitely eager to have them communicated to as many people as possible. But they're also a function of imperial rhetoric. So the way you praise an emperor, the way you talk about an emperor, you find this language in petitions. So this is a hugely important glue for this society, is that anyone could basically petition the authorities for, let's just say just about anything. That's not technically true, but there's a lot of petitioning going on. So, if you think something's wrong or you've been treated unjustly, you can petition local officials, even imperial officials. You can petition the emperor, right? And the expectation is that that petition will be read, addressed, and answered. Now, it might not be answered in the way that you want, but it will be answered. And those responses contain this language also, right? So these are the different media through which the emperors are broadcasting this persona. And that persona is what? Basically, that the authorities are responsive to the needs of their subjects, that they are often accountable. In other words, they understand that they are exercising public power and that their mandate is to exercise it solely for the benefit of their subjects. They keep saying this. So
that is part of the propaganda machine, by the way.
Renouncing any kind of private interest. In other words, we're not doing this for our benefit, say the authorities. We're doing this for your benefit.
Of course.
Also that they're proactive. So the emperors are constantly saying that we're planning ahead. We're trying to foresee what problems you might have, and we are solving them before you experience them. And that they are also working very hard. So hardworking. In fact, one of the cliches that they keep using is sleepless. The emperors keep saying that I'm losing sleep over this. I'm not sleeping at night because I'm just worrying so much about your problems and how to solve them. Justinian, for example, was publicly known as the sleepless emperor, and not because he was a demon whose head floated around in the palace on its own, which some people...
That's a thing?
It was a thing.
Okay.
That's a whole thing.
But sleepless in terms of work so hard.
But I hope they go into that one. This actually reminds me that the Roman emperors actually are very proactive. A bit too much if you think of someone like Nero, but in general, when there was the explosion at Pompeii and the volcano, the speed at which Roman authorities countered it. Like the immediate sending of rescue teams and trying to secure the population, figure out the situation, scout it, understand what happened, is insane. They went very fast. And reading the sources about it, it's fascinating how quickly the authorities reacted to it. Also considering the fact that they had no idea that that could happen. I mean, this is a theory of mine, so maybe take it with a grain of salt. But the way I understand is that the Romans did not know that the Vesuvius was a volcano. They had forgotten, because the previous eruption, we know this, is prehistoric. And even though you look at the mountain now and you see the shape of the volcano, that's because the explosion, the eruption was so violent that it blew off the top. But if you look at images of the before, like for instance mosaics that represent the Mount Vesuvio, before the explosion, it has a normal peak. It doesn't look like a volcano at all.
Yes. There's no time to sleep.
He was a workaholic. That is conceded by even his enemies.
Cool.
All night he was up, just hauling officials in at any old hour to talk about whatever, wars and architecture and laws, and to religion and theology and whatever. So the emperors are projecting this image, right? So that's what I call the persona. Tireless effort to work on behalf of subjects, to do so responsibly, to be responsive and accountable. In other words, if some of my officials breaks the law or oppresses you, I'm giving you instruments, like legal instruments, by which to hold them to account.
It is insane how advanced Roman law is, and to a point that it still is used and creates a foundation of modern law. It is a lot of stuff that they made up, and if you think about how advanced they would have been in comparison to other civilizations of the time, it's unbelievable. Even like rights for children, like this is something that I think we should bring back, by the way. But you know how Roman children, boys were wearing these little amulets that looked like the sun around their neck, and little girls that's little boys, and little girls were wearing half moons, symbols of the moon instead. And these not only were a customary thing, it's something that Roman did with their children, and it's a shame that we Italians stopped doing it, because I think it's really nice. But it also gave you legal protection. So if someone messed with a child, and the child was wearing one of these, then the law would go against them multiple times fold. So it's like you don't touch a Roman child. And now, given were these kind of legal protections available for non-Roman citizens and their children? No. What about slave children? No. So that's a shame. But that this level of legal protection, because I mean, if you think about it, probably could make someone think about it twice. But like, oh, I'd like to mess around with it. Oh, but wait, she's wearing the half moon. Lunula is what it's called. No, I'm not fucking with that. Harsh on that kind of crime? Yeah, I think we do need it.
So that's the persona. It's very consistent, and I think it's part of the mechanism of tying the society together. In other words, if subjects think that...
Yeah, that's what I said. Moon for girl, sun for boy. Yeah, that's what I said. Yeah.
Their emperors are like this, right? They're more likely to agree to the consensus of essentially paying taxes.
And you draw this distinction between rhetoric and action. What the authorities say and what they actually do. Yeah. So when you say persona in the modern times, some of that could be reframed as propaganda, for example.
Yeah.
And propaganda implies that that there's a big gap between the rhetoric and the action. And
propaganda implies that there is a big gap between rhetoric and action. Again, I like Lex Friedman a lot. He has presented a lot of good questions. I'm not sure about this definition. Propaganda doesn't necessarily have to have a difference in rhetoric, the difference between rhetoric and the action. In fact, a lot of the times there isn't. I know I'm being pedantic, but pedantic is my middle name, innit? What do you guys think about that statement? I'm not sure about the statement. Why? Not necessarily. Propaganda can be something, it could be false, but the action will follow what propaganda pushes a lot of the times.
The things you said you took away from reading Machiavelli is that we should judge people not by what they say, but by what they do.
Right.
So how much of the Roman Empire's government, of what they espoused, was merely rhetoric, and how much was true in how they acted?
Yes. Mm-hmm. This is a key lesson I took from reading Machiavelli. And I found this a very insightful way of thinking about politics. And I would recommend that anybody kind of practice this way of looking at the world, right? People and states and, powerful people can say anything they want to. At the end of the day, what matters is what they actually do.
Yeah.
And this doesn't mean that what they say is irrelevant, even if it's discordant with what they do. But nevertheless, in the case of the East Roman state, so my research suggests that the emperors and the authorities were generally sincere in what they said. In other words, I have found that they generally did what they said they were going to do overall. Not perfectly, obviously. And of course, these are human beings we're talking about. Right? They're human societies. There was a lot of, corruption. And
But could you imagine that, though? I mean, this is interesting. Propaganda was a thing anyways. It was a thing all over the place, and the Romans used it. Look at, for example, the damnatio memoriae, when they're like, this emperor was so bad that we're going to delete anything in existence that refers to him so that we remove him from memory and from history. That's a problem for historians when it happens. The Romans apply it. You will not, it's not a matter of like Voldemort. It's like 10 times fold. We'll destroy every picture. We'll put down every statue. Any mention. It's like he had never existed. That's what damnatio memoriae. So the damnation of the memory of said individual. And this was a form of propaganda. But in general, regardless of that and the fact that propaganda is a thing, as he said, there is pro-imperial propaganda, but there is also anti-imperial propaganda. And oftentimes when you read the sources, you have to be cognizant of the fact that, yeah, but this person is really an anti-imperial supporter. He hates the emperor, he's pro-republic and the pro-senate. And so a lot of the times the information they tell us about the emperors, particularly like if you look at Elagabalus, some of the information is real, but other things they say is very likely it's anti-imperial propaganda. And so things are inflated, it's exaggerated. Even when they mock him and say, oh, he puts on makeup, what does he want to become, a woman? He's a woman. He thinks he's a woman. And then today, modern transgender people that made, like the activists, they take that to be like, see, he was transgender, he identified as a woman. No, it's anti-imperial propaganda. They're making fun of him because he's of Syrian descent and because of the fact that he was a priest of Elagabalus, which is the god by which he's nicknamed. One among their ritual practices was the fact that priests would put on makeup. But from the perspective of the Romans, who puts on a makeup? A woman. So what is he, a woman? He thinks he's a woman. And then today the activist is taking it as it's clearly anti-imperial propaganda. No, he was a priest of Elagabalus. He was a sexual deviant. He was insane. Like the stuff that he did, the grape of for instance, by Elagabalus, of the priestess of Vesta, the virgin priestess, and the grapes one. I mean, the Romans didn't like him, and that's why they beheaded him and threw him in the river. All of this to say, yes, propaganda is a thing. But the fact that politicians tended to do what they promised the people, it doesn't surprise me. Because there is another major difference with modern day politicians that can literally say whatever they want during the election year, and then they don't have to do it. They can tell you we'll have taxes, and then they don't do it. And it often happens. Like they don't have to do it. And so that difference is massive, but there is another massive difference between ancient leaders and modern leaders. And that is, ancient leaders went to battle. Think about it for a second, and then I'll let him speak for a little longer, but think about it for a second. Alexander the Great led cavalry charges, and he was there spearing to death his enemies, together with the Macedonian cavalry, and he was getting hit. Luckily, he was wearing best armor that they could fabricate, so whatever. But can you imagine modern day politicians actually going together with a commando, leading the commando with the gear, like, let's go, bro. Can you imagine that? Completely different class of people.
You name it, abuse, of course there is. But overall, I think that there was a sufficient level of understanding that the emperors are in fact doing this, and they were actually incentivized to do this.
Interesting.
We talk about how, because they were also in a pretty vulnerable situation too.
Oh, yeah.
So they needed their subjects to be relatively content on this front.
Isn't this surprising to you? So, from the outsider point of view, Roman emperors, even in the East Roman Empire, technically have a lot of power.
Oh, yeah.
You can even say, in some cases, absolute power. And yet, they seem to be awfully worried to make everybody in the empire happy.
Well, yeah, but particularly the Praetorians. You don't mess with the Praetorians. There are situations where the emperor is like, I'm going to halve the stipend of the Praetorians, and then the Praetorians behead him. It's like, I mean, yeah, you got to keep particularly the Praetorians happy, and then possibly try to mitigate the number of enemies you have with powerful senators, and then there is the people. Isn't it interesting that ancient governance really wanted to keep the subjects content, whether it be through lies, whether it be to bread and games, but the idea is just make sure the subjects are happy. Modern politicians don't want the subjects to be happy. They want us to be mad at each other. It's a different strategy, but it's very effective. Because if you're happy, then you're not mad at the leader, at the ruler. Likewise, if you're angry, because I hate the left-wing guy and the left-wing guy hates me, we're not mad at them. So the objective remains the same. The objective remains the same, and a people that is not united is easier to control.
What explains that? Like, what explains the small gap between rhetoric and action in the East Roman Empire?
A number of things, but ultimately it is that there is no right to the throne. And this is a function of the Roman matrix of politics here. In other words, so here's a bit of a paradox.
Okay.
What we call the Roman Republic was the most imperialistic phase of Roman history. Like, this is when the Romans did most of their conquering.
Mm-hmm.
What we call the empire is much less imperialistic in this way. That's much more defensive in its approach, right? And yet our terms are a little mismatched in that way. The empire is more a function of the that it has an emperor rather than it is engaged in imperialism. And that emperor emerged out of the republic. But emerged out of the republic in a very strange way. In other words, not as a dynasty that created the state. So, for example, if you think of the Ottoman Empire, many other empires, the whole thing existed because this dynasty engaged in conquest and was successful in creating the state. And so the dynasty was like at the heart of the state.
Yeah.
But that's not at all the case in the Roman Empire. The emperor is a figure who emerged within a republic. And in order to create peace after the civil wars, those emperors had to, for a long time, kind of pretend that they were not what they really were, by basically, continuing to flatter the idea of a republic that is, that has a first citizen, maybe. Oh, no, I'm not a king. I'm
Princeps. Yeah, exactly. Very good. It's all about optics, isn't it? You were asking, what is it? Doesn't divide and conquer come from a Latin quote? Oh, yeah, for sure. It's divide et impera, with the long phonemic vowel length at the beginning. In fact, as a modern day Italian, my natural pronunciation would be divide et impera. But the Latins, it's not a matter of stress, it's a matter of phonemic vowel length, but it's divide et impera. It's the other way around, it's at the beginning. Sometimes the phonemic vowel length in classical Latin is tough as a modern Italian because they elongate vowels that I never would. And that is because of it's called accento tonico in Italian, the fact that we tend to accentuate the penultimate vowel. This is why Italians, when you kind of make fun of our accent, what do? We tend to say mangiare, dormire, andare, right? It's not, the stress is not on the first vowel, but it's not at the end. Anglophones tend to stress more often the beginning, and instead, more often, not always. The French tend to stress at the end. Italians, we tend to stress on the penultimate. Once again, not always, but it is a characteristic of our accent. I've exaggerated a little bit, but that's how it is. When we say amare, what I'm doing is that to love, or amore, love, I'm putting the stress on the second syllable. And what that does is that basically what I'm doing, I am lengthening the duration of that vowel when I put the stress. I am increasing ever so slightly the volume, and sometimes the pitch goes up as well. This doesn't happen on all stressed languages. I don't think it happens in Hungarian, but it does happen. And the Latins, however, they tended to have these vowels that, like for instance, in English you say lorica segmentata, right? In English. In Latin, it's lorica. So both the O and the E, that's the Roman armor, right? The O and the E are long. As an Italian, I would say either lorica or lorica, but I would never say naturally lorica, where both are long. And this happens so much, and every time I have to catch myself when I'm doing a reading in classical Latin, because that's one, and it is important because it's phonemic, meaning it changes the meaning of words. You see this, for example, in that it's a distinctive feature. And in languages, a distinctive feature is when you have two sets of identical words. Mechanically, they are identical. There is only one distinctive feature, and that is, for instance, the length of the vowel. An idea is malus versus malus, or palus versus palus. The second one, it's the difference between swamp and stake, like a stake, a pole, and a swamp. The only difference, how long the A is. And the other one, malus versus malus, is interesting because it's the reason why you have an apple in the Bible in the story of Adam and Eve. Because it's a word play, meaning that they mean apple or evil. It's the same word, it's just different length of vowel. And that's why they decided, oh, that's great. The apple, then the fruit in the Garden of Eden, let's make it an apple in the Vulgata, because that way there is the idea of, it's kind of sounds similar. It's an apple, but it's also evil. In the original text in Hebrew, we have no idea what the fruit is. It could have been, it's round, that's what we know, but that's it. It could be a date, it could be an orange, or it could be a wild type of fruit that no longer exists. Who the heck knows?
Just I have this office and that office and that office, whatever the Senate has given me. Now, we understand that's a facade, but the fact that they had to create this facade at all is very important.
Can we actually just linger on that? I mean,
Yeah.
how much of this, because you said they had to create this facade.
Yeah.
Did Augustus, who started the whole thing, the first emperor of Rome,
Yeah.
did he have to act that way? Because he kept acting like he's not an absolute
Yes.
monarch. And he could have gone hardcore, destroy the Senate, just full hardcore rule.
Well, then
Easier said than done.
how does he govern then?
So he wants to be an effective governor,
Oh,
and
yeah.
he also wants to not be overthrown.
Exactly. Because, just because you ended one civil war doesn't mean that there's not going to be another. You have to create a consensus such that people don't want to have another civil war.
Right.
If he did what you said, which he in theory could have done, but that would have just led to more wars, right? So the problem is that the emperors, even those who come to power through violence, they can't prevent other people from trying to come to power through violence because, like I said, no one has a right to the throne.
We should also say one more thing where, dare I carefully say this, but it seems like riots and civil wars is a feature, not a bug of the system.
Yes.
This is a different thing that we have to the modern day, is because the threat of a violent civil war where you overthrow the government, and there's just a lot of...
And again, it happens even in dynastic situations. Look at China.
Yeah. Death and struggle for power is always a threat. That's another incentive, I guess the stick, not the carrot, but the stick for the emperor to behave.
Yes, it's the main one. In other words, just take the 1,000 years that I study. There's something like 120 civil wars. Now, these are usually very swift. They're over quickly, and they're never about ideology. So they're not like modern civil wars, right? It's about slavery or the rights of kings or whatever. No. They're solely about who has the power.
Right.
All sides have the same ideology. They talk about,
I'm not sure all sides have the same ideology. I might have to push back on that because you do have different political parties in Rome, and you have people, they tend to hate each other. So oftentimes when there is a civil war, I might make a video about this actually in the future, maybe on the 4th channel, Metatron History. But when you look at like the historical characters, particularly during a civil war, and you see this emperor or this general versus this general, he wins, he becomes the emperor. It's because they oftentimes belong to opposing parties. This does happen. So I might have to push back a little bit on that. For instance, there is this very interesting conversation between Emperor Claudius and the senatorial class. And they are talking about citizenship rights. So Claudius, to give you an idea, is kind of the side that says, no, let's make the Gauls citizen. He's not talking about all the Gauls in that instance. He's actually talking about the aristocracy. And the senators are pushing back. They're like, no, they're not real Romans. They shouldn't have citizenship. And then Claudius actually has this very interesting way by which he's saying, well, neither were your ancestors. Your ancestors were Etruscans. They were not citizens, but here we are. And then he's like, let's do it. You know how he pushes it and then actually works? Is because he says, they're rich. Let's take their riches. Literally, we have an incentive. He's not saying everyone. He's saying, but these aristocratic families, bring them in, make them gentes, create this new fabric, give them citizenship so we may partake in their richness, in their wealth. That's how he sells it. Rome is always about taxation, innit?
the responsibility of government in the same way. right? They're just competing over who's the best man to do the job.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so once you have that situation, and it might not be a civil war, it could be a palace coup, it could be a kind of fighting in the capital, something like that.
Or legions.
Once everyone's taken their side and you have a winner, that's the emperor, and you often overthrow the previous regime. I'll give you some statistics. Something like 46% of the emperors of Constantinople are overthrown through violence.
46%. I didn't know this because usually my studies focus on the Principate. So it's great to hear this. But goodness gracious, 46% of overthrown by violence? Oh,
no. That's almost half. Right? So that's a huge number, which means that every emperor is vulnerable and insecure, and they know it. Right? So what they have to do is make sure that that doesn't happen to them. And the way to do
their family
that is not by arresting and executing everybody you think might be a threat, or just generally behaving like a Caligula or a Nero.
Right.
That will just get you killed. Like, they know this. So the best way to avoid that fate is to actually do the things that will make people happy, so that they don't support a rebel if a rebel decides to appear. And sometimes rebels would appear. There's a kind of convention in Constantinople. Like, if you think, that emperor is pretty unpopular, and I think I can overthrow him. What you would do is you would march down the center boulevard, and you'd have your people just call the populace of Constantinople out to rally, to, maybe go to Hagia Sophia, the church, and just create a big crowd and call for the deposition of the emperor, and maybe that would happen. And sometimes it did, and sometimes it didn't. And the rebel or wannabe rebel would sort of proceed down the boulevard, and people would just gradually just disappear, and then he'd be left alone and go up to Hagia Sophia as seeking asylum, right? So that's a bid. That's someone making a bid for the throne, and it just goes disastrously bad. Other times, the people come out because they hate the emperor, and they drag the emperor out and cut his nose off or whatever. So emperors are constantly trying to prevent that from happening, and the best way to do that is for goodwill.
Also, again, goodwill of the Praetorians. Like I have this entirely dedicated video on the Praetorians and how they changed throughout the centuries because they were reformed multiple times, and who could become a Praetorian and what kind of class of citizen we're talking about. Their salary continuously goes up. It's phenomenal because, the Praetorians are the ones that are going to prevent the people to take you out if that happens. So you want to make sure that, and again, as I say, there are situations where the emperors tried and they didn't go well, which was fascinating. Let's watch a couple more minutes and then we switch to the next one. But I like it. It's a very good video, very good podcast.
I'm trying to load in that kind of world because it's a different world than we live in today.
Yes.
There's a constant inner workings of policy development inside government.
Yes.
But the check on power is like literal, like, we will murder you.
Yes, it depends on the period. Sometimes murder you, sometimes blind you, sometimes cut your nose off. But there were periods...
Thank you for the nuance.
No, there were periods that were more civilized. We'll just basically, you get retired to a monastery.
Right.
Okay. You're right. So here's what elections do. Elections give a government a mandate for, 4 or 5 years. And during that period, you may be unpopular, but you're legitimate, right? Because of the institutions. Whereas in Constantinople, we don't have those kinds of institutions. We have instead an ongoing referendum. We just call it a perpetual referendum, right? And in fact, the emperors they're conducting opinion polls in a sense because they appear in public. They appear in public, everyone is expected to cheer and chant acclamations, right? Like slogans, right? So you have 100,000 people in the Hippodrome all chanting, worthy or many years for you, Augustus, or something like this. And if that happens, it's great. But if you appear in the Hippodrome and people are like sullen, if the chanting is a bit tepid, or if they're booing, then you know something's wrong, right? So you got to find out what's wrong. It could be something like the grain supply is not working or whatever.
Those Sicilians not producing the grain, unbelievable, am I right?
And so emperors are desperate to fix those problems.
And the Hippodrome is this big gathering place in Constantinople.
Look at
which
that.
I guess a lot of people gathered at and did this kind of cheering or not cheering.
Bro, this reminds me of Centurion Defender of Rome for Sega Genesis. Do you guys remember that? That was amazing. Anyways, we did a good 20 minutes of reaction to this, I think, because I'm trying to keep my videos to a maximum of 35 minutes. So I'm trying not to get the videos like 1 hour and a half because it doesn't seem to work any differently, for me at least. Anyways, if you appreciate my content so far and wish to help ensure my ability to continue to tell it how it is, regardless of any possible backlash, please support this channel on Patreon. Any support helps me and my team of academics keep the channel strong and gives us the means to fight back against the political rewriting of history. Stand with us, form the wall, defend the truth.